lives, that we would worship you and we would prostrate ourselves before you, and that we would pray on a daily basis, often as you have instructed us to. We pray, Lord, that you'd be with this church, continue to be with our leadership, the elders, guide them, and be with them as they lead us. Be with us in this class, in this study. In Jesus' name, amen. Starting in verse 17, remember what just happened. What just happened that we talked about on Wednesday night. They're about to go to Judea again. Now, where have they been? Let's see if I can, if this works. Oh, look. Oh, my map is there. So if you were here Wednesday, my map was not part of the slide deck. So you can see here, and really all you need to see is the colors, which is why I put the colors on there. Red is Jerusalem. The blue is this wilderness area called Perea, or it's sometimes called the Perea. If you can see the green line, that's the Jordan River. And then there's a little yellow arrow, which is really hard to see, I guess, even for me now. There's a yellow arrow and a yellow dot. And that is kind of the area we think that was Bethany beyond Jordan, okay? This was what I was looking for on Wednesday night. So this is where Jesus has been. Now in verse 16, Thomas, who is called the twin, said, "Let us go also that we may die with him." So Jesus is about to come back to Judea, kind of the purview of the Jews. So he's coming back into danger again, basically. And we're going to try to get through this whole chapter all the way through the end of chapter 11 this morning. So I'm going to try not to rush, but I am going to try to get finished. And it says in verse 17, let's read 10 verses here. It says, "So when Jesus came, he found that he had already been in the tomb 4 days." Now, what are we even talking about here? Just to review, Lazarus has died, okay? Lazarus, his friend, has died. He received a messenger, and so they are going back to another Bethany, okay, which is where Mary, Martha, and Lazarus lived. And Jesus frequented this area and this town because he knew them well. We talked about that on Wednesday. So Jesus was going to Bethany. So when Jesus came, he found that he had already been in the tomb 4 days. Now Bethany was near Jerusalem, about 2 miles away. And many of the Jews had joined the women around Martha and Mary to comfort them concerning their brother. Now Martha, as soon as she heard that Jesus was coming, went and met him. But Mary was sitting in the house. Now Martha said to Jesus, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that whatever you ask of God, God will give you." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha said to him, "I know that he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, though he may die, he shall live. And whoever lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this?" She said to him, "Yes, Lord. I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who is to come into the world." So there's some things we want to look at here. Look at verse 18. It says, "Now Bethany was near Jerusalem, about 2 miles away." Now we talked about this. We talked about this on Wednesday as well. Bethany was 2 miles kind of to the southeast of Jerusalem, on the other side of the Mount of Olives, okay? And here we read that many of the Jews had come from Jerusalem to mourn the death, because this was a community. Everybody knew, it sounds like a lot of people knew Lazarus, Mary, and Martha. So they had come to comfort them and mourn with them. But in verse 20, this is an interesting little detail. This is another one of those little eyewitness details. Now Martha, as soon as she heard that Jesus was coming, went and met him. But Mary was sitting in the house. What an interesting little detail, right? Martha went out, but Mary stayed behind and was sitting in the house. Again, another detail that we love from eyewitnesses like John. But in verse 22, it says, but even now, as Jesus is questioning Mary, she says, even now, I know, actually it wasn't, Jesus is not questioning her yet, but she says, but even now I know that whatever you ask of God, God will give you. So this is a great statement of faith, right? Mary comes out of the house, goes and meets Jesus in a place where we don't actually know where they were. But she comes out and she knows, number one, that if Jesus had been there, Lazarus would not have died if it would have been his will. But also, number two, that Jesus can simply ask of God, and God can do whatever he wants. Now, some people have taken Martha's statement as a bit of a rebuke of Jesus. Like, why did you not get here sooner? Because remember, what does it say in 17? This was many days later at this point, probably nearly a week later than Jesus initially heard the news, because he had been in the tomb already 4 days. So that means they had to embalm him. He had died. Tim, did you have something? Which I think was Jesus' point. That's definitely why he procrastinated. I don't know if that's the right word, but he waited to go. Procrastination is not the right word. When we talk about Jesus, he did not procrastinate, but he did wait to go. And we know why he did it, in order to build faith. Yeah, Martha? Yeah, absolutely. And we've seen that in other places, haven't we? That's a really good point. So in 23 and 24, did I miss something? Okay, maybe it was the door. In 23 and 24, this is kind of interesting. Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Martha said to him, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. Do you find it interesting that Martha kind of took Jesus' words as an allusion to the ultimate resurrection? We don't commonly read that, do we, with especially Old Testament-based Jews. Do we read much of that in the Old Law? You could be right, although, in fact, I think you are right, although, you don't need to turn here, but I'm going to read you 2 verses out of Daniel 12. Daniel 12, verse 1. It says, at that time shall arise Michael, the great prince, who has charge of your people. And there shall be a time of trouble, such as never has been since there was a nation till that time. But at that time your people shall be delivered, everyone whose name shall be found in the book. And many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. So there are references in the Old Testament to an ultimate resurrection. They're just a little obscure. Now, who did not? There was a sect of the Jews who did not believe in the resurrection. Who were they? Sadducees. That's right. Did you say they're sad, you see? I like that. So in Mark 12, verse 18, it says, and the Sadducees came to him, who say there is no resurrection. And they asked him a question. Also in Acts 23, verse 8, for the Sadducees say that there is no resurrection, nor angel, nor spirit, but the Pharisees acknowledge them all. Okay? Nice. You must teach a lot of children's classes. So the Jews generally believed in the resurrection, although the Sadducees did not. Okay, just to kind of get some clarification. Any questions or comments before we keep going? We're going to hit verse 25 next. Okay. Verse 25, it says, Jesus replied to Martha, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, although he may die, he shall live. And whoever lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this? I have to say, and I love to point out passages like this, I think these are two of the most beautiful verses in all of human language, especially to the dying Christian, are they not? It is almost as if when you have a relationship with the Almighty, when you have a relationship with Jesus Christ, it is as if death never even happened at all. It's almost as if nothing bad at all happened. Because even though, as Paul says here in 2 Corinthians, he says, for we know that if the tent, okay, and what is a tent? It's just a temporary shelter. If the tent that is our earthly home is destroyed, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. And he goes on to say, for in this tent, in this temporary body, we groan, longing to put on our heavenly dwelling. That goes exactly with what Jesus is saying here. We are groaning, those of us who have a relationship with the Lord, to be with him. We want so desperately to be with him that even death is not something we fear. Am I right? Philippians 1 verse 20 says, as it is my eager expectation and hope that I will not be at all ashamed, but with full courage, now as always, Christ will be honored in my body, whether by life or by death. And then the famous verse in Philippians 1:21, for me to live is Christ and to die is gain. So when Jesus says, he who believes in me, though he may die, he shall live, this is a foundational statement of our faith, isn't it? Let's see some heads bobbing. Yes or yes. It is. All right. Now, let's look at what Martha says in verse 27. She said to him, yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who is to come into the world. Now, this is interesting. When we get these great confessions of faith, what do we normally see as a follow-up, maybe not normally, but what do we sometimes see from Jesus afterwards? Some kind of, not adulation, but at least an acknowledgement that this was a great confession, right? You have confessed. We don't see anything from Jesus here. And I will suggest that if we keep reading, we're going to see that Martha still has some growing to do in this chapter. Any questions or comments?
She didn't really answer the question. I mean, she made a great statement of faith, but she didn't answer the question.
Okay, yeah.
I don't know whether that had anything to do with him not affirming. Maybe this is where we were looking for a second affirmation of that, what she said, and as you said, she's not there yet.
Yeah. Well, what did she also not do? I forgot to ask this. With the blind man, what did the blind man do back in chapter 9, verse 38? He said, Lord, I believe, and then what did he do? Worshipped him. We don't see that here either, do we? Now, you never know. It could have happened. I don't think so. John usually records things like that. But we don't see that either in this particular text. So it's missing a few things. But let's keep reading. Any other questions or comments before we keep moving? Doug? Absolutely.
Furthermore, I think Lazarus being in the tomb for 4 days, I think that's there to give us great contrast with Jesus only being in the tomb for 3 days. Jesus, according to the Jews, as was said earlier, his body wouldn't have seen decay. And here's Lazarus. I mean, we're going to get to here in a minute. He smells awful because he's been dead for 4 days.
Yeah.
His body has already decayed.
Or they're assuming that anyway. Yeah.
I think there's great contrast there.
Definitely. Definitely. Anyone else before we go? Carrie.
To tag on what Doug said, it also distinguishes this miracle from what, Elijah and Elisha did. I mean, it's not the first time someone's been raised from the dead. It happened. And people, of course, they knew this. And so it really separates the glory of this miracle from what they can recall or remember from what the prophets had done.
Yeah. Well, remember there was also the raising of the woman in Nain. Okay, the woman, I think it was her son. I didn't teach that lesson, but there was also the raising of her child. So this wasn't the first resurrection, but this is also the most important one to John because it's the one that really kind of raises the ire of the Jews, as we will see. This is really the kind of the turning point, and we'll see that here in a minute. Thank you for that, Carrie. So let's read 28 through 37. And when she had said these things, she went her way and secretly called Mary, her sister, saying, the teacher has come and is calling for you. As soon as she heard that, she arose quickly and came to him. Now Jesus had not yet come into the town, but was in the place where Martha met him. Then the Jews who were with her in the house and comforting her, when they saw that Mary rose up quickly and went out, followed her, saying, she's going to the tomb to weep. Then when Mary came where Jesus was and saw him, she fell down at his feet, saying to him, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Therefore, when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her weeping, he groaned in the spirit and was troubled. And he said, where have you laid him? They said to him, come, or Lord, come and see. Lord, come and see. Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, See how he loved him. And some of them said, Could not this man who opened the eyes of the blind also have kept this man from dying? All right, let's review these last few verses. There's a few verses here I want to point out. Verse 28 through 30. I have a question. Why did Jesus not go to Mary and Martha's house? Why do you think? Right. Where were bodies usually buried? In town or outside of town? Always outside of town, never in town. Okay, so he's waiting outside the town somewhere. Could have been near the tomb. I don't, he did ask where they laid him, but he was outside the town. But also, remember, the Jews are looking for him at this point. Jesus knew what he was going to do here, didn't he? He came specifically to raise Lazarus. You think he wanted to get into a big public ordeal with the Jews before he did that? No, this was the capstone miracle on his ministry. This was the miracle that was really, again, we're going to see later in the chapter that this is where it all turns. And I believe his plan was to not raise the ire of the Jews right now, but this miracle was going to do that. Let's go die with him. Yeah, sounds like Thomas kind of got it, didn't he? Jesus didn't rebuke him for that, did he? Didn't even say anything back to him. So, interesting point. Now, when we read this, and notice, this is why I say what I do. When Martha had said these things in verse 28, she went her way and secretly called Mary. Now, the Revised Standard Version uses the word quietly. She probably understood that Jesus did not want to arouse a big crowd. There was going to be one, but not yet. All right, let's look at verses 33 and 34. Therefore, when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her weeping, he groaned in the spirit and was troubled. Does anybody know what that means? What does it mean to groan in the spirit?
In this case, there's some discussion among the scholars about what it really says. It's more of a groan of agitation and frustration. It's not a sadness. You don't believe it.
That's exactly right. The Greek word here is, I'm not going to say this right, but it's inebrimasato. And what it refers to the snorting of a horse. When a horse gets angry, that's what this refers to. And Jesus this represents human anger. Now, there's also this word troubled. He was troubled. And that is ataraxin. Probably saying that wrong too. But it indicates agitation and confusion. When you're mourning, do you sometimes feel that way? Do you sometimes feel angry about events when you're mourning the death of a loved one? I know I have. It's frustrating. At least for us, there's nothing you can do. It's just a frustrating part of life. I think we can see Jesus' true dual nature here. He is being entirely human at this point. He sees the scene. He sees Mary, Martha, they're crying. He's upset. Lazarus was his good friend. And he's succumbing to real human emotion. So I think that's important for us to realize here. Now, verse 35. We all know this is the shortest verse in the Bible. We teach it to children. What's the shortest verse in the Bible? Jesus wept. But I suggest we should remember this for other reasons. Number one, Jesus is showing real tenderness, right? He's showing real emotion for his friend. The scene is tough for him. But this is our Savior. And isn't it a comfort to know that he has experienced what we have? In Hebrews 4, chapter 15, it says, "For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. Let us then, with confidence, draw near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in need." What is the Hebrew writer saying here? Because Jesus was tempted like we were, went through all of those human emotions like we did, with boldness we should approach him. We should pray to him and go to him because he understands. It's really a beautiful thought. And then we can also learn that it's right for us. I know Christians who are not very, they try not to be emotional when a friend dies. You think that's the right thing to do? Not me. And the reason why is because I think as Christians we should, number one, sympathize with people who are mourning, and also be joyous for those who are experiencing joy in their lives. Romans 12, verse 15 says, "Rejoice with those who rejoice. Weep with those who weep." It is the Christian thing to do, to lower yourself and mourn with people, and mourn for people who have passed on. Yeah. Yeah.
He felt it for, in spite of what Mary said to him, which could have angered him in one sense. But the flip side of it, she lost her brother.
Yeah.
And these are people that Jesus loved. They had a special relationship. And yet he is the Almighty. He said, unequivocally, here's who I am, and here's what is true, if you believe in me. And now they're not experiencing, they're experiencing the other side, the reality of what that means in this life.
Yeah.
But yet he weeps and he has sorrow and he wants them to be comforted. That's it. I think it's a powerful message for us.
It is. Yes, definitely. Thank you for that, Tim. Hey.
You can kind of sense the frustration in Jesus, maybe to the point of anger. When Martha expressed her faith in Jesus and says, if you would have been here, you could have either prevented or stopped his death. But then Jesus could have probably thought, well, I can bring him to life, back to life too. But you know,
Yeah, don't you believe that?
looking at that way, you know, you're just looking at what I could have prevented.
Yeah. Hey, Gail.
You know, also, here Jesus in a way is saying, I have the same emotional feeling as you are. I am human. I am God and human. It's the same thing when Jesus saw the people, he had compassion on them. And so I think although he is God in the flesh, he is God in the flesh, he still has the very same feelings that Mary and Martha had.
Isn't that an amazing thought? Because he can feel what we're feeling at the time.
Obviously, there in Hebrews, it does explain it very precisely.
Yeah.
We have a high priest. He's had everything we had.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it is a good explanation there.
And he's not hard like these Jewish leaders, is he? They harden themselves. They're very serious. Jesus wept. He allowed himself to feel the emotion. This is God. This is our Creator who understands us. Someone else said, hey, Julie. Oh, it wasn't? Okay. No, I don't think so at all.
when we feel those things. And I think when Jesus, in this instance, and also when he not go through the crucifixion, like there are clearly times when he's having these human emotions, and I think that that's really freeing in the fact that God expects us to feel those things, and then we turn those things over to him.
Yeah.
But we're not supposed to not feel them. It doesn't make it wrong that we get anxious or fearful. It's what we do with that.
That's an outstanding point, and very well said. Thank you for that. Who else? Somebody was going to say something. Was that you, Daryl? Right, in verse 6, yeah. It hits him. Right. Yeah. It happened for the glory of God, but it happened with his friend. And which is all the more touching, which I think John goes out of his way to discuss that this was his good friend. And it is a beautiful story. All right, so we got 10 more minutes. Yeah, go ahead. That's actually probably a good point. I've never thought about it that way. I do think he was probably weeping for Lazarus, but maybe secondarily because of the situation. You know how that works. We all go to funerals. And sometimes we go to a funeral and we didn't feel any emotion until we got to the funeral and we were around all the people who loved that person, right? Yeah. Yeah, she wasn't there, was she? Yeah. Oh, and I absolutely believe that Martha believed in Jesus, no doubt. The extent of her belief may have been still immature. That's probably the best way to put it. So let's move on very quick here. In verse 38, it says, "Then again, Jesus, groaning in himself, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone lay against it. Jesus said, 'Take away the stone.' And here's where we want to pay attention. Martha, the sister of him who was dead, said to him, Lord, by this time there's a stench, for he's been dead 4 days. This is kind of that area where, okay, maybe I don't quite believe you're going to raise him. I'm not sure what you're going to do here. But in verse 40, it says, Jesus said to her, did I not say to you, if you would believe, you would see the glory of God? So here's a mild rebuke, right, of Martha. I mean, we see a mild rebuke from Jesus here. In verse 41, then they took away the stone from the place where the dead man was lying. And Jesus lifted up his eyes and said, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. And I know that you always hear me. But because of the people who are standing by, I said this, that they may believe that you sent me. Now, when he had said these things, he cried with a loud voice, Lazarus, come forth. And he who had died came out, bound hand and foot with grave clothes, and his face was wrapped with a cloth. Jesus said to them, loose him and let him go. So we see this almost anticlimactic climax to this story. We see Lazarus come forth, and then he said, loose him and let him go, and now we're going to go off and talk about the Jews. This is the way John has presented this to us, right? But I want to notice Jesus' prayer real quick. He says, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. Jesus has already prayed to the Father, hasn't he? He's already prayed, and he already knows that God has granted this. Number two, Jesus knew the Father, and the Father heard Jesus' prayer. Number three, this prayer is one of thanksgiving. It's not a request, is it? Jesus publicly thanked the Father for granting his request. Now, fourthly, I would say that this prayer yet again shows his complete dependence on God, the oneness of them. 1 second, Tim. And number five, he offers this prayer for others to hear and learn that he again was truly sent by God. Yeah, Tim.
That last point I think is significant. He's been saying over and over and over again, I and the Father are one. I don't do anything or say anything the Father doesn't tell me to do or say. And this is the most powerful manifestation of that can't be denied by anybody who sees it.
Yeah, he wanted them to hear it, and John wanted us to read this. This is very important for us to know. All right. Last section here, or almost the last. We're going to try to speed through this. There's some good stuff in here, though. Okay, so Lazarus is raised. He comes out in the grave clothes. I don't personally believe that he was wrapped like a mummy in Egypt because he came forth. Don't know what that looked like, but they did have to loose him from the grave clothes of some kind. Starting in verse 45. Then many of the Jews who had come to Mary and had seen things Jesus did believed in him. Okay, so this was a big turning point. The Jews who had come from Jerusalem believed. This was a miracle that could not be refuted. But some of them went away to the Pharisees and told them the things Jesus did. Then the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered a council. Wonder what council that would be. Gathered a council and said, what shall we do? For this man works many signs. If we let him alone like this, everyone will believe in him. And the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation. And one of them, Caiaphas, being the high priest that year, said to them, you know nothing at all. Nor do you consider that it is expedient for us that one man should die for the people, and not that the whole nation should perish. Now this he did not say on his own authority, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the nation. This is an interesting thing we're going to come back to here in just a second. And not for that nation only, but also that he would gather together in one the children of God who were scattered abroad. A couple more verses. Then from that day on, they plotted to put him to death. Therefore, Jesus no longer walked openly among the Jews, but went from there into the country near the wilderness to a city called Ephraim, and there remained with his disciples. Let's back up real quick and look. Now, we see here in 45 through 48, this is the summation of what we've been talking about regarding the Jews this whole study. What are the Jews concerned about? It says, some of them went away to the Pharisees and told them the things Jesus did. And the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered a council. And by the way, the Sanhedrin is primarily made up of those groups. Okay? So this is basically the Sanhedrin getting together and talking about what do we do. And what does verse 47 at the end of it say? This man works many signs. What are they admitting? They're true. We cannot refute this. We can't, they're not even accusing him of blasphemy here. They're actually saying he's performing many signs. So, this is what we're going to do. So Caiaphas, who's the high priest, by the way, he was not just a high priest that year. He was high priest for like 15, 18 years. I think from AD 18 all the way through about AD 35 or 36. So he's the high priest at this time, and he kind of laughs at the council. He says, you don't even know what you're talking about. All we have to do is sacrifice one man for the nation, and the Romans will get off our back. And here's the plan. This is the turning point. This is where kind of I guess you could say the passion is going to start. Okay? And I want to get this one thing in real quick, and then I'll take some comments. So Caiaphas, we see Caiaphas in a couple of other places. All right? But I want to read this because this is super important. Caiaphas, in Matthew 26, verse 3, it says, then the chief priests and the elders of the people gathered in the palace of the high priest, whose name was Caiaphas, and plotted together in order to arrest Jesus by stealth and kill him. That's Matthew 26, 3 and 4. But I want to read this to you because this is great. The Israeli archaeologists have discovered the family tomb of Caiaphas in 1990, the Jewish high priest who presided at the trial of Jesus and delivered him to the Romans to be crucified. Buried in an ancient cave on the outskirts of Jerusalem, the family's bones were sealed in ornate and elaborately carved ossuaries, these boxes we talked about before, widely used by the Jews of the late first century. One in particular stood out in splendor. It was decorated with a rare, intricate pattern of rosettes and carried the inscription, Joseph, son of Caiaphas. Joseph was another name of the Jewish high priest now known as Caiaphas, who ruled in Jerusalem from AD 18 to 36. In this ossuary were the bones of a 60-year-old man. The age of his bones, the inscriptions on the ossuaries, and the artifacts that surrounded them all point directly toward his influential family. And then there's a quote. I can hardly imagine a more significant discovery from that period, said Bruce Chilton, professor of religion at Bard College and an expert on early Christianity and Judaism who has written widely on Caiaphas. So we have the bones of Caiaphas. Now, if you ever have trouble believing that the Bible is God's word, we continue to find this archaeological evidence. Just like we found the tomb of Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, we have the tomb of Caiaphas. These things happened, and you should and can believe. There you go. See you Wednesday. Thank you.